Now that we get more stateful components and hence can really see lifecycle hooks, let's have a look at the lifecycle hooks we learned about for the component creation. Let's start with app.js. There I told you you have this constructor, and the constructor receives the props this component gets. Only the constructor, so we still can't call props anywhere else in this component class, just in the constructor could we access props title. Everywhere else it has to be this props title. Now for this to work, we actually now need to call super props, otherwise this props won't succeed. I can actually prove this to you if I comment this out and save this. Now you see we get an error. Missing super calling constructor. So the error already is pretty clear about what's wrong. Now before we implemented the constructor, it worked because React did automatically reach out to the super constructor. So to the constructor of the component we extend. But if we implement our own one, we override React's default, and therefore we need to do this though. So call super and pass on props. It's a useless constructor right now, as ESLint warns us though, because we don't do anything else. So let me log something, and I'll create a log statement where I'll say app.js so that we can easily see where this is coming from inside constructor. This makes sense, and let me also pass props here. Now if we save this and our app loads, you see we got this console log here on the right, app.js inside constructor, and we see that props is an object where we have this title. Now let's implement the other hooks too. This would be component will mount. There I will also console log and say app.js inside component will mount, like that. Now with that, let's save this again. And once this reloads, you see that first we're executing the constructor and then component will mount. Now, one more word about the constructor, by the way. We're initializing state down here. Now, as I mentioned, you might still see code snippets where state is instead initialized here. You can do this by calling this state, make sure to call super first, this state, and then initialize it just as we do it down there. So this is basically an alternative syntax. I don't necessarily recommend using the constructor, because it's easier to implement state initialization like we did before. But if you do have a constructor, you can absolutely do that. It doesn't really make a difference. Both is fine. And this is code you might still see in some other tutorials, because in older versions of React, or to be precise, in older versions of the project setup created for React, we didn't have access to this relatively new way of initializing properties in ES6 classes. So that's why this is the approach which will work in most projects, whereas this will only work in modern project setups as we use it here. So with that, you will see it still works fine. We got all the same state and behavior as before, now initializing state in the constructor. Back to these lifecycle hooks though. We have the render method next, if you recall our slide. And we already have this implemented because every stateful component needs to have this. It's the only mandatory one because React needs to know what to render. So there I will also now console log app.js inside render, like that. If we save this, we now also see that render gets called on third position, just as you saw it on the slide. And now let's implement component did mount. Now I'll implement it here at the top. The order doesn't matter, but typically or often you will see lifecycle hooks being implemented at the top. Component did mount here. There we'll also log something app.js inside component did mount, like this. And now if we save this, we can also see that this is called last. Now that's interesting. Let's now add these lifecycle hooks to other stateful components too. So I'll copy them and move to persons.js. There I'll paste them in above the render method. I don't want to initialize state here because I don't use state in this component. And I need to adjust all these console logs now. So here we have persons.js, and we also have that down there in these two logs. And in the render method, I'll also add a console log statement where I say persons.js inside render. Now it's getting interesting. If we now save this, let's see when all these persons lifecycle hooks get executed. So let's, as I said, make sure you save this and reload the page. And you see, we don't see them at all. It makes sense because we only show this persons list conditionally. As soon as I click toggle persons, you see them all. Now actually, what you could see there is that render of the app.js, so of the root container, was recalled, which makes sense because the state changed, so it recalled, it re-executed render. And then you see that the person.js constructor was executed, will mount, render of persons, and inside did mount. Now let's also add all these methods to person.js. Above render here too. Make sure to adjust the log so that you can identify it, and implement a log in the render method there too. Console log person.js inside render. Now let's save this file too. And now let's see this one more time. When the app loads, we only see app.js. But now it's going to get crowded once I hit toggle persons. So let's dig our way through that. First of all, we have the initial app.js calls up until here, component did mount. Then we click the button and this retriggers render of app.js, because obviously the state changed, it needs to recall render to see what changed. Then we execute the persons.js methods up until render inside the constructor, where we receive the props of persons, so of this component which renders the array, inside will mount, and inside render. But then, and that's important, we don't see persons.js inside component did mount. Instead, we continue with the person.js component. And that makes perfect sense. Recall that slide. This step after render child components. This is the reason why we don't see component did mount yet, but why we see person.js inside constructor and so on. Because we rendered the list, and the list has 3 person singular components. That is why we see person.js all the way up to render 3 times. And thereafter, we see person.js did mount 3 times. This is 3 times here. And thereafter, persons.js component did mount. And this is exactly the order you saw on the slide. It goes down the component tree and renders them. And in these methods, you would have a chance of running your own code. But even with just logging this, it's interesting to see how React works and how it actually creates this component tree. Now, creating is one interesting thing. And of course, it creates functional components in the same way. There we just can't add our lifecycle hooks. But if you don't need to run any logic, you don't need them. But creating components is one interesting thing. Let's now have a look at what happens when we actually update components. How does this lifecycle hook look like?